we go. Everyone has their book. Okay. So we are in lesson number 5, Judaism Decoded. Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a good week. Hope everyone had a good holiday. And here we go. So until now, we talked about the idea of the Torah and the different levels of Torah. We talked about the received Torah. We talked about the derived Torah, the legislated Torah, the different aspects of Torah, and finally the custom aspect of Torah. Today, we are going to discuss a very interesting question, and that is, can we change the Torah? Can the Torah ever be changed? And this is a very relevant question because we live in a modern world that changes basically every day before our eyes, and who knows what happens from day to day. And before we know, the world is different. So in the world of Twitter and Facebook, and in the world of YouTube or whatever it is, can you say that the Torah is able, that you can change it for things that come up, for questions that come up? Now, of course, this would be relevant in many different aspects. But number one, is there a need for Jewish law to change? And do we have the authority to change it? Now, this was actually a question that was brought up last week. So I said we're going to address it. And just so you know, next week we're going to discuss the final issue, which is, how do we know that the Torah is true? Can you intellectually prove that the Torah is true? But that's going to be next week. So again, we have 4 different kinds of laws within the Torah. We have 4 different parts of Torah. The first one is the one that we would call the received Torah. And that is the Torah which is received, that God explained, that God gave to Moses, Mount Sinai. We just celebrated the whole idea of the received Torah. We celebrated that on the holiday of Shavuos. We read the 10 Commandments. That is the Torah that God gave us in Mount Sinai. The second one is the derived law. The derived law that our sages derive from different forms and formulas. Can that be changed? That would be the second question. The third question would be laws that are legislated by our sages, as we explained, the different types of laws legislated that are for different reasons, whatever it may be, either to help the population or to educate or whatever it is. Why a law would be legislated is another point. And finally, the question about customary, could customs be changed? And you know, you have in the United States, for example, you had an alcohol ban from 1919, and then it was replaced by a ban in 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment. Could you ever do such a thing within Jewish law? And that's what we're going to talk today about. So let us begin with the first text in your book. And that is text number 1A, page 157. Again, your book is found in the chat box. There's a link to it, to an online link that you can open that up. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to post it in the chat box and we will get to whatever we can. It is clear, this is from Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, who we've been quoting a lot. He discusses the transmission of the Torah in many ways. It's clear and explicit that the Torah that is commanded, that Torah and its commandments remain forever without change, diminishment, or addition. As it states, you shall be careful to perform all these matters that I command to you. You may not add to it or diminish from it. And it says, what God revealed to us is for us and for our children forever, to carry out all the words of this Torah. This teaches us that we are commanded to fulfill all of the Torah's directives forever. It also says it is an everlasting statute for all your generations. So based on this, you would not be allowed to change the Torah. The Torah is forever. The Torah will be forever, for all generations. Text 1b, the ninth fundamental principle concerns nullification, that the Torah of Moses will not be abolished and that God will not give another Torah. There will be no additions to the Torah nor any subtractions from it, neither in its text nor in its received explanation. So there never will be another Torah. There is the Torah, and that is what the Torah is. God revealed himself in Mount Sinai. That's what we celebrate in the holiday of Shavuos, that God revealed himself in Mount Sinai. That was a one-time event that was and never will be. God gave his Torah and said, this is what I want. This is the way it will be. So if there never be a Torah and there will never be subtractions from it, so does this mean that there can never be changes in the Torah? Now, the truth is that there are two reasons why we have to say that a Torah cannot be modified. Can you say that the fact that the Torah was given 2,332 years ago, that it might be relevant today in the year 5780? Does God not catch up with the times? Doesn't God know that the world today is a different world than it was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago? Doesn't God know that we're on cars today and that we're not riding horse and buggy? Doesn't God know that there's Twitter today as a form of communication instead of people riding on horses to get to one place or another? And the reason that you need to say that you can change it is because God is omniscient. He isn't, and he's not worth, if he's not, then he's not worth worshiping. God is one that doesn't change. And therefore, the reality is that the Torah the mitzvahs that he gave was, is, and will be for all times. And when there are circumstances that arise, then there are mitzvahs that will become relevant, that you can say that there are mitzvahs that will become irrelevant. And there are many mitzvahs that we do not perform today due to the conditions that make them not necessary. For example, the mitzvah of Yovel, the Jubilee year, certain mitzvahs that have to do with the Holy Temple. So, nevertheless, the Torah is telling us that the Torah needs to always be the way it is, because God's commandment reflects the needs of the archaic age. But if that's the case, then why would the divine commandments all be necessary? If mitzvahs were responses to a particular temporary circumstance, God could have left it to human beings. So God is actually saying that the Torah is dictating what it is that that's happening in our life. It's unalterable because God is unalterable. God is not telling us to do what fits for the times. God is telling us that this is what a mitzvah is, regardless of the time that you're in, and whether or not you are able to keep it at that way, it is still relevant in some way or another. So it never actually changes. Let's read what the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, says in text number 2. The Zohar states that the Torah and God are one. This means that the Torah is nothing other than the expression of God's wisdom and will. This is text number 2. God compressed his will and wisdom within the 613 commandments of the Torah and their laws. He did this so that each soul, through invested in a human body, should be able to intellectually comprehend his wisdom and will and live accordingly in action, speech, and thought. when this occurs, the Torah and its commandments encompass the whole person, and the person is completely and literally bound up with God in the bundle of life. So this is telling us that the truest definition of the Torah is that it's God's wisdom and will. And God's will is and cannot be changed, because God himself transcends the physical experience that exists independently of what goes on in this world. And so does his wisdom and will also transcend what happens in this world. And so the idea then that God commands, that God's commandments are reaction to the circumstances, is something that we can't go about, because God lives beyond the world itself. God is beyond, transcends everything that happens in this world, and therefore is not affected by the world. If you're saying things are affected by change, then number one, the first problem is that it obstructs the channels through which we bond with God, because you say there are certain things that don't allow anymore us to connect to God. And if we say that there's change, then that would be a problem. And number two, we would lose touch of what the foundation blocks, we would lose touch with the very foundation blocks of this world, as we're going to soon explain. So there's 3 points here. Number one, you can't say the mitzvahs are reactions to certain circumstances because they're above it, because the mitzvahs are God's will. And just as God's will doesn't change, God doesn't change, the same too, his mitzvahs, which are essentially his will, doesn't change. Number two, and therefore, if God doesn't change, neither does his mitzvahs. And number three, if we change Torah, then we're going to lose this connection, because that means that you're missing what God's essential desire is. You have somebody that wants something specific in a very specific way. If you're going to come along and say, I want it differently, then that loses that connection right there. It's like, going back to the example that we gave last time of the relationship between spouses. If one spouse says that they want, let's say, a red house, and that's what they want, so you can come along and give 10 blue houses, but that's not what they want. They want a red house or a red flower or whatever it is. And that's what the Zohar adds as follows. The Zohar says that not only is that God, in other words, the conventional understanding is that God gave us the Torah because God created the world, and now God needs a way of how we should relate to him. But the Zohar tells us that that's not actually the case. You look in text number 3, the Zohar, the mystical teachings of the Torah, teach us as follows. When God resolved to create the world, he looked into the Torah, into its very word, and fashioned the world accordingly. So it's not something of the past, meaning it's not that God needed a way to deal with the problems in life, needed a way for us to find a connection or a meaningful life, because now that he created man, so now he needs some way to bring about that life to make it meaningful. No, the Torah is the code behind the world, just like you see here, just like a computer code. The Torah is the blueprint of creation. Sometimes it may not look exactly right. If anybody's ever seen blueprints, you can see pages and pages of blueprints, which essentially are just basic drawings. They don't look anything like the house. But to the trained eye, you know what those represent, and you know what it actually looks like. The building, the structure, or like the example you have here of a computer. You have the back end of the computer is a bunch of numbers and words that essentially don't make sense unless you have a trained eye that's able to understand what those words are, what those numbers are. But everything that happens in the front end is essentially happening through that. Everything that happens in the world is happening through the Torah. The Torah is the direction and the and the way that it is headed. The Torah is the one that creates the world and is the blueprint of the world. So the implications of this passage are enormous. Every moment in history, the realities of the world are reflecting Torah, not vice versa. The Torah and the world are inherently intertwined. One organic entity always, with the former dictating the latter and not vice versa. So the Zohar is telling us that it's not that we have a world and now we have to fit the Torah into the world. It's actually the opposite. The Torah is dictating the change within the world. And as a matter of fact, again, to the trained eye is able to see how things that are happening in the world happen through Torah. There's once a woman who came to who had a private audience with the Rebbe. And she asked him, how do you always know things that are happening in the world? I mean, if you talk to, you see that there's a lot of, we post on Fridays, we post the weekly story, and you see stories, interviews with people, for example, in the Tzahal, in the IDF. And they say they would go and meet with the Rebbe, and he would talk about streets in Israel that he's never been to and he's never seen. And they have no idea. How is he supposed to know what these streets are? And yet he dictates word by word. He goes and says exactly what's happening in an army base in Israel. He's never been there. How would he know? So someone once asked this to the Rebbe and said to him, how do you know everything that's happening in the world? And to give people blessings for certain things, how do you have any idea what's going on? And the Rebbe said, I don't know what's going on in the world. He said, I know what's happening in Torah. Torah is the blueprint of the world, and everything that happens in the world is according to Torah. So I study Torah, I see what's in the Torah, and through whatever happens in the Torah, that's how I know what happens in the world. There was once a meeting that he had with a general. They were talking about a tragedy that happened of a bomb that hit somewhere, and unfortunately there were many soldiers who were killed. And the soldier said that there were 22 soldiers that were killed. And the Rebbe told him, no, there were 23. And he said, no, I have the list, there were 22. And he said, no, it can't be, I know there were 23. And they went back and looked into what happened, and they saw that there were actually 23 and there was a miscount. So he asked him, how did he know? So he told him that my job is to connect to every soul. And I saw the souls of these individuals as they were going up to heaven. I saw each soul who they were, and I saw that there was another soul that was not counted for. And I know that this individual soul was going up to heaven. So the point is that there are certain people who are the, so to speak, the codifiers. My brother, I have a younger brother who does coding for computers. Today it's a very good job, very well-paying job, coding. He lives in California, of course. But there are people who are coders for computers. They know the background. Most of us, simple people like me, I don't know what the code of the computer looks like. I just know what the front end of the computer looks like. I don't know how, if I want to start a Zoom, I don't know how it works in the back end. I know I press the button and the Zoom starts. Anyway, the point is that what happened, that the truth is that our assumption is always that the world is changing, and so let's change the Torah to fit within the way the world is changing. But the Zohar teaches us that we have it all wrong. It's not that the world is changing, and so therefore, let us change. Let us change according to the world. No, the Torah is dictating the change in the world. Everything that happens is if somewhere in Torah. There are codifiers who know how to see that. So if you see how there are things that are happening in the world, crazy every day, something else crazy happens in the world. Those who see it on a deeper level are able to understand what that is. So if we cannot change the word of God and cannot play around with his wisdom, what if God changes his mind? Is there such a concept? Can you say that God will change his mind and maybe will tell us something that was never revealed or change something that has been before that? Is there such a concept? And the answer is that God addresses this in the Torah. What if I change my mind? God addresses this in the Torah. And God says as follows in the Torah in Deuteronomy 18:15, God says, text number 4, God will set up for you a prophet like me from among your brethren, and to him you must listen. God says, I'm going to set up a prophet. And a prophet is going to tell you things that you may not have seen in the Torah. You may not find in here. And yet he'll come along and tell you certain things and say, this is the will of God at this time. How does a prophet know? Well, we know that there have been Jewish prophets throughout history. There's Jeremiah and Deborah and Micah and Miriam. They're both male and female prophets. And Samson and, all these great prophets. They knew the will of God. How did they know the will of God? Because God told them in different ways what the will of God is. Well, you say, okay, there are other people who come along in history and also say that they're prophets. So how do you know if they're a prophet or a charlatan? So first of all, only certain people can become prophets. These are some of the characteristics that you need. First of all, it has to be wise and great personal character. The Maimonides tells us what the things are. They can never be overcome by evil inclination or selfish desires. They have to constantly work on themselves to never be affected by that. Thoughts must be constantly directed upwards and not be distracted by vanities. They always have to be focusing on God. And they have to predict something that comes to pass in all its details a number of times. And by the way, the Maimonides, just as a side point, the Maimonides actually tells us that anyone essentially can be a prophet. If you go through this process and you work on yourself, you can maybe, obviously you can't decide if God will rest his prophecy on you or not, but you could be a vessel for prophecy. Anyone can if they truly work on themselves. But only trusted, as I said, once the predictions come to pass in all its details and a number of times. Text number 5, if a person will arise, Jew or Gentile, and perform a sign or wonder, and say that God sent him to add a mitzvah, withdraw a mitzvah, explain a mitzvah in a manner that differs from tradition received from Moses, or that the mitzvah are not forever, but were given for a limited time, this person is a false prophet. For God instructed Moses that this commandment is for us and for our children forever. So how do you know if someone is a false prophet? Someone is a false prophet if the things that they are prophesizing are that God says, I want you never to do to stop doing a certain mitzvah. Okay? Or I want certain things to be uprooted from the biblical law. So prophets can come along and say that God is going to bring upon the Jewish people so-and-so, or so-and-so is going to happen to the people, or you shall repent, or whatever it is that they're saying. Take a look in the prophecies of Isaiah and Yeshaya and Jeremiah and whatever it is at the time that's relevant. But there's one thing that they can't say. They can't say that God said, you no more have to keep Shabbos, or that God said, you no more have to wear tefillin. If they're saying such a thing, then you know it's a false prophet, which, without getting into detail, is not the point of today's discussion. But, people ask me all the time, how do you know that the other famous religion is not a true religion. You know, people say, you know, how do you know that JC is not really a prophet? And while there are many explanations to it, there is really one simple answer. And that is that if a prophecy is coming to change or uproot the Torah, that cannot be a true prophet. And that is the answer. So being that you have an entire new religion, it's essentially not in line with the teachings of the Torah, you know that that's not a true prophet. Very simple. You don't need any other answer. So, text number 6. Some say that in the same way we believe, this is from Reb Saadia Gaon, also one of the enumerators of the mitzvahs. Some say that in the same way we believed Moses because he performed wonders and miracles, so we must believe a prophet who wants to abrogate the Torah if he performs wonders and miracles. I was greatly astonished when I heard this remark. We did not believe Moses only because of his miracles. We believed him and all the other prophets because they called upon us to do something that did not go against one of our fundamental beliefs. When we heard their words and they met this criterion, we asked for signs. And when they provided signs, we believed them. But if someone calls upon us to do that which goes against one of our fundamental beliefs, we do not ask for any signs. No sign can support the impossible. This is similar to two people, Reuven and Shimon, appearing at a trial. If Reuven claims from Shimon something in the realm of possibility, for example, he owes me 1,000 dinar, the judge will ask him to produce witnesses. And if he does so, the money will be awarded to him. But if he claims something that is in the realm of the impossible, such as he owes me the Tigris River, his claim will be void from the outset because nobody owns the Tigris. It is inconceivable that a judge would even ask for witnesses to substantiate this claim. So it is with anyone who claims to be a prophet. If he tells us God commands you to fast today, we ask him for signs. And if they are realized, we believe him and we fast. But if he says God commands you to commit adultery and to steal, we shall not ask him for a sign because he has told us the impossibility, something no true prophet would say. So this is the rule of prophecy. Prophets could give a prophecy, but you can't support the impossible, like an orange banana, as you see in the picture. So what he's telling us is the impossible is telling us that God has a different plan, that God no more is trying to, that God no more wants us to keep the Torah and mitzvahs. That is something that is the impossible. And this is what he's saying. A prophet cannot change the Torah. A prophet could say something that's relevant to a time. A prophet could say something that's going to happen. A prophet could say something that exists. And even if he brings miracles, that prophet might do the most beautiful, incredible miracles. But if he's changing the Torah, that prophet is irrelevant. Rabbi Moshe Sofer, known as the Chassam Sofer, says as follows. The notion that the Torah is not in heaven, Deuteronomy, is that a prophet may not innovate anything after Sinai. It is the foundation and root of the entire Torah. If not for this principle, we would be left without any Torah at all. I refer you to the anecdote recorded in the Talmud when a heretic argued that since the Jews were exiled from their land, the Torah of Moses was revoked from a different Torah was given in its place. Possibly such people could perform signs and miracles by means of deception or sorcery. In fact, the prophet of the Ishmaelites did so, and Shabtai Tzvi said that Torah prohibitions became required mitzvahs, and required mitzvahs became forbidden. Even if we would not believe this to nullify the entire Torah at once, if we would believe such people, not a single commandment would remain unaltered. Every individual would say, I had a dream that this type of fat is prohibited and the other is permitted, and so on, and the Torah would fade away. So this is essentially a reasoning behind it, that the Torah would fade away, because if you say that people have the ability to change Torah, everyone will claim to be a prophet, and everyone will claim that they are able to change the Torah. And as you see, he references the famous Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi was considered a possible prophet, and many people followed his prophecy. But again, what happened with him? In the end, he went in the Muslim tradition, and he got rid of many of the biblical Torah laws. So that's how we knew that he was a false prophet at his time. So again, you want to know, is someone a right prophet? Is it not? Is it a good religion? If not a good religion, there's one very simple question to ask. Is whatever is taught in line with Torah and mitzvahs the way they are given by God and Moses? Then you know that they are right and they could be a good prophet. If not, then not. Obviously, today we don't really have real prophecy. Most of the prophecy ceased at the time of the destruction of the first temple. But this is a very relevant point. Now, to put this into perspective, we're going to show that even heaven, even God himself agrees that the Torah cannot be changed. And when the prophet suggests that the Torah has to be changed, we assume he's a false prophet. Even if he does miracles, it could have been a sleight of hand, it could be magic, it could be luck, it could be anything similar. So the fact that he performed miracles is not a proof. As a matter of fact, the Rambam says that Mashiach doesn't even have to do any miracles to prove he's Mashiach. Mashiach just has to bring the ultimate of Torah and mitzvahs to the world. So to illustrate this in a much more dramatic fashion, we're going to take an interesting anecdote from something that happened in the Talmud. Aren't all the Rebbes considered prophets because they had the characteristics you listed? Yes, to a certain degree. They are obviously prophets, but a Rebbe essentially is not his purpose to give a prophecy per se. The purpose of the Rebbe is to be exactly that. Rebbe means a teacher, a guide, a leader. So yes, they are prophets. They're prophets like Moses, in the sense that Moses was a leader of the Jewish people. And every generation has that kind of leader like Moses. When we're referring to prophets, we're not necessarily referring to a generation leader, which yes, they are a prophet as well, but we're saying people that come to teach something specific. Now, many prophets were generation leaders too, but not necessarily were they. In the time of the temple, most of the leaders were prophets in different ways. But that wasn't always the purpose of individual prophets. Sometimes the job of the prophet was simply to give a message and not necessarily to lead a generation. But many of them were, as we know, we mentioned some of the people before. You have the prophet Ezra, and you have the prophet Deborah, and you have the prophet Samson, and most of them were leaders as well. But they're not necessarily, what I'm just saying is they're not necessarily together. They could be individuals that not necessarily are both. Generally, prophets are also generational leaders, but it's not necessarily always that way. The book, the student book is, if in the chat box, is the Google Drive. You see it says Drive, Google, there's a link there. That is the chat box. I have my phone sitting here. Every time I say Google Drive, it thinks that I'm saying, hey, Google, and it wakes up. Okay. All right, so the answer is that yes, many generation leaders, many Rebbes per se, are prophets as well, but not necessarily is every prophet a Rebbe. Okay, let's put it that way. All right, let's go on. So here's an interesting anecdote, an interesting story from the Talmud. we need a little bit of a background to understand what this is. During the temple era, some foods, such as korbanos and tithes, can only be eaten while one is ritually pure. We've talked about this. A person or food could become I'm sorry, one second. Wait. Back up for a second. Okay. So a person or food could become impure by coming in contact with a pure utensil. By impure utensil, such as if that thing touches a corpse, which is impure, so that could become impure. Okay, this is the laws of impurity. So it's very complex laws. Now, there are different types of utensils that could become impure, and some have the status of the ability to become pure or impure. Without getting into it, it has to be a vessel of a sort, and it has to be considered a full vessel. And there's different laws of whether it's a pottery vessel, or it's a vessel made out of glass, or it's a vessel made out of wood. Different things can become impure in different ways. Again, by coming in contact with something impure. So the sages had a question about an oven called an achnai oven, as you see here. The achnai oven is made of not one piece, but it's made of different layers. Watch how this is. It's constructed of layers of clay coils, and sand is placed between each layer. So watch how this is created. You see? You have these coils, and then sand is created between each piece, and then there is pottery put on the background. Now, the whole discussion of the debate back and forth is not really relevant. All you have to know is this. Don't worry about the technicalities. All you have to know is this. Rabbi Eliezer says it is permanently pure, and our sages say that it is susceptible to ritual impurity. This type of oven. Again, don't worry about the technicalities of why and what and how it's constructed. It's not so relevant to our discussion now. All that we have to know is that there's a dispute regarding this oven. Rabbi Eliezer says it is permanently pure oven, and our sages say that it is susceptible to ritual impurity, which means that if it comes in contact with a dead corpse or a dead animal, then it could become impure. So that's text 8a. If an oven is constructed on layers of clay coils and sand placed between each layer, Rabbi Eliezer decrees that the oven will be permanently pure and it cannot become impure, while the sages declare that it's susceptible to ritual impurity, and this is the achnai oven, okay? Again, don't worry so much about the technicalities of it. All you have to know, again, is Rabbi Eliezer says this achnai oven cannot become impure. It is always permanently pure. Even if it comes in contact with something impure, such as a dead body, it will still stay pure. According to the sages, it is susceptible to becoming ritually impure. Now, the point of the discussion is really the next text, text 8b. On that day, Rabbi Eliezer brought forward every imaginable argument to prove that the achnai oven is not subject to ritual defilement. But the sages did not accept his arguments, right? So he was arguing with them, they didn't accept his arguments. Said Rabbi Eliezer, if the halacha agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. There was a carob tree sitting there. Thereupon the carob tree was uprooted and moved a distance of 100 cubits. Others say 400 cubits. So he says, look, the carob tree proved it. They said, no proof can be brought from a carob tree. They retouted. Again, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream of water began to flow backwards. No proof can be brought from a stream of water, they rejoined. Again, he urged, if the halacha agrees with me, let the walls of the academy prove it. Now, this was already not a very good idea. Okay? Whereupon the walls inclined to fall. Rabbi Yeshua rebuked the walls, saying, scholars are engaged in a halachic dispute. What right have you to interfere? The walls did not cave in completely in deference to Rabbi Yeshua, nor did they resume their upright position in deference to Rabbi Eliezer, and they are still standing thus inclined. Again, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha agrees with me, let the heavens prove it. Thereupon a heavenly voice proclaimed, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer? The halacha follows his opinion on all matters. Rabbi Yeshua arose to his feet and exclaimed, the Torah lo b'shamayim, a verse from Deuteronomy, the Torah is not in heaven. What does he mean, said Rabbi Yirmiyah? From that day the Torah was given at Sinai. We pay no regard to heavenly voices, for you have already written in the Torah, follow the majority. Okay? So, what is the point over here? Again, what exactly they're disputing is not relevant. The point over here is Rabbi Eliezer did everything to prove that he is right. Now, why a carob tree and why a stream of water? This is one of the great Talmudic discussions that have much ink spilled on this. And there's much to say about it, which is way beyond the scope of today's course, of why a carob tree and what the stream of water and why the walls and what he wanted to prove and why was he doing this. The point over here is that even the heaven said, you're right, Rabbi Eliezer. And the sages said that Torah is not in heavens. God gave us the Torah, and the Torah, the heavens himself, God himself says, I have to follow the rules that were created by the courts down here, and the rule is to follow the majority. And this is essentially the lesson that we want to bring out from here. So, why did the heavenly voice intervene on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer? If the heavenly voice agrees that you really can change it, the Torah lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven, and nothing could essentially be changed, and you have to follow the majority. So why did the heavenly voice intervene for Rabbi Eliezer in the first place, if that's really true? The heavenly court, if it was going to say out a message to say, ladies and gentlemen, you have a dispute. I already told you in the Torah the right way to act upon it is to follow the majority. That's what God should say, seemingly. So let's read what Rabbi Chaim Baghdadi, known as the Ben Yehoyada, says. Text number 9. Certainly it was God who caused the miracles in the heavenly voice that supported the view of Rabbi Eliezer. He did so in order to secure the future of Torah upon a steadfast foundation. God knew that the sages were resolute and truth-seeking. He knew that the miracles in the heavenly voice in support of Rabbi Eliezer would not convince the sages to contravene even for one command of the Torah, including the instruction to follow the majority. God therefore caused the miracles in the heavenly voices so that the sages' disregard of it would generate an important precedent for future generations. No person will ever be able to nullify even one word of the Torah. For if even the miracles in the heavenly voice could not persuade the sages to change the Torah law, certainly then nothing would be able to persuade us to do so. God intended that the awesomeness of this story and the publicity it engendered such result at its lesson remaining with the Jewish people for generations. So God knew that they're eventually going to follow the right way. And therefore God says, look, I'm going to prove that this is the right way to go about the Torah from the fact that, watch, the sages are going to make the right decision. And God knew they were going to make the right decision and say the Torah says follow the majority, Torah is not in heaven. And this became one of the very fundamental stories, if you will, in the Torah, that in the Talmud, that helps bring home this idea of the importance of following the Torah and not changing. Now, before we go on to the second half of the lesson, which is, well, basically you just said for 45 minutes that the Torah can never be changed. So what's the point of this lesson? You just came here to tell me the Torah can never be changed. Is there any way the Torah could be changed? So we're soon going to see that there are certain ways that the Torah could be changed. And we're going to get that in a moment. But first, I want to ask if anyone has any questions on anything that we taught so far. Otherwise, we'll continue on. Again, you could either write it in the chat box or you could unmute yourself. And if not, we will move on. No questions? Okay, as I always say, when there's no questions, it could be one of two reasons. Either everyone understands it so well, or it's that no one knows what's flying and therefore you don't have any questions at all. Could be one or the other. All right. So now comes the question. So based on everything that we said, is there ever a time or ever a situation where the Torah could be changed? And the answer is yes, sometimes. But we first needed the introduction to tell us that the Torah essentially can't be changed. Now that we have that introduction, we can go to the second half, which tells us, but in certain situations, it could be so. And let's take a look. Number one is a temporary injunction. If there is a certain situation that happens and the prophet sees at that time, a need to change a certain law. Now, we do have the law, as everyone knows, that saving a life, you could break any law for saving a life. And that's why you have, for example, now they close the synagogues. And based on that, our rabbis of this generation said, let's close all the shuls. Even though that would be a very unusual thing to do, close all the shuls. That was a temporary injunction. They did not intend that they're going to close down the shuls forever. The temporary injunction to save lives. There are other ways that you could have a temporary injunction. The first one is Elijah the prophet, as we'll get to in a moment. Let's first read text number 10 from Maimonides. When people who have already established themselves as prophets instruct us to violate one of the mitzvahs of the Torah or many mitzvahs, no matter their severity, but only for a limited amount of time, then it is a mitzvah to listen to them. We have learned this from the earlier sages who transmitted this received law. Hearken to everything a prophet tells you, even to violate a precept of the Torah, like Elijah did on Mount Carmel. But only do so if it's a temporary instruction, and do not hearken even temporarily if he tells you to serve idols. I made a blessing before. So what is the story of Elijah and Mount Carmel? What happened was there were many Jews living in the northern kingdom that had forsaken God, and they began tinkering to idols. Elijah challenged the king Achav, who was a very wicked king, and at that time they were all serving a famous idol known as the Baal, which was a very low-life sort of service. But anyway, it was called the Baal. So he said, we're going to stage a public showdown, if you will. And he said, let the Baal prophets choose one bullock for themselves, cut into pieces and lay it on the altar, but put no fire under. He said, I'm going to do the same. He says, you shall call to your gods to the Baal, and if he gives you whichever God gives a fire, that God will be the accepted one. And they went and they were not able to get a fire. And then he went ahead and he said, pour buckets of water and buckets of water. And eventually he prayed to God. It was the Mincha prayer. And a fire came down and consumed the sacrifice. And they all said together, Hashem hu Elokim, Hashem hu Elokim. Hashem is our God. And we say this on Yom Kippur. We say it 7 times. Hashem hu Elokim. This thing that they called out as they were amazed by what happened. They prostrated themselves. And that's the story of Elijah the prophet. And Elijah was an established prophet, and he was an accepted prophet. So he had the right to suspend the law for a specific need. What law did he suspend? He suspended the law that says that you're not allowed to make an altar outside of the temple. He had to do this because he had no way to get the message to them, because they were not going to come to the temple. If anybody knows the history, anybody ever been to Mount Carmel where the story took place? No, you can go to Israel today. If you come, hopefully, God willing, we're gonna take a trip to Israel next year, the one that was canceled this year. And they do have the option of visiting Mount Carmel with the story of Elijah there. So I haven't been there before. It's interesting. They have a little cave where Elijah lived and so on. Anyway, the only exception to this law is idolatry. If a prophet is going to tell you to serve an idol, then you cannot listen to that prophet. Another example of this, the Torah tells us you cannot destroy fruit-bearing trees during warfare. And Elisha, another prophet, the prophet Elisha, commanded the Jews to do so when they're battling Moab. So again, he didn't say that it's no more a mitzvah that you can't destroy a fruit-bearing tree. He said, at this point, we have to break that law. That was Elisha the prophet. So he said you could chop down the fruit-bearing trees. It's an interesting mitzvah. If anybody didn't know this, you're not allowed to cut down fruit-bearing trees. Another example was when it came to the prophets, when it came to King Solomon, King Shlomo, that year, the temple was dedicated in the beginning of the month of Tishrei, and they had a big celebration, and they were feasting for 14 days. They basically feasted from Rosh Hashanah all the way until Sukkot. Now, in between that time is a holiday called Yom Kippur. And according to tradition, we're told that they did not fast that Yom Kippur. That was the year that the temple was built, that they dedicated the temple. That year, they did not fast on Yom Kippur, and they ate on Yom Kippur, and an unspecified prophet told them that they can eat that Yom Kippur. Again, the prophet didn't say, you no more have to fast on Yom Kippur. The prophet said, this year, you don't have to fast on Yom Kippur. Very different point. And then another example was with Shimon the high priest. What happens with him? What happened with him? So it is forbidden to leave a temple when clothed in the priestly vestments. And what happened was Alexander the Great, he came to occupy the Holy Land of Israel, and the Samaritans slandered the Jewish people and accused them of conspiring to rebel against Alexander. So Alexander came to destroy the city. Shimon the high priest came out to greet Alexander the Great as he came up. He walked up to the mount to the temple, and he greeted him. And what happened was, at that point, Alexander got off his horse, got off his high horse, quote unquote, and bowed down to Shimon the priest. Why did he do that? Because he said that whenever he goes to war, he sees the image of someone promising him that he's going to win the battle. And he said that this is the image of the man that I see. He said, Shimon the high priest, this man comes to me in an image, and I see he's going to promise that I'm going to win a war. How could I destroy his city and his temple? And so Alexander the Great left the temple standing and made sure that nobody was going to bother them for many, many years. As a side note, there's nothing to do with the class, but as a side note, Alexander became a Jewish name because that year, many Jews wanted to name their children after Alexander to thank him for not destroying their temple. And that's how Alexander became a Jewish name, even though it's essentially a Roman name. Okay, text number 11. If a Bezdin deems it appropriate to temporarily suspend a positive or negative commandment in order to bring many people back to the Jewish faith or to prevent many Jews from committing various transgressions, they may do whatever is necessary at that time, just like a doctor amputates a person's hand or foot so that the person will live. So too, at times, the court may rule to temporarily violate some of the mitzvahs to preserve overall mitzvah observance. In this vein, the sages of the previous generation said, desecrate one Shabbos for a person's sake so that the person will keep many Shabbatot. All right. So that is one thing. So you wanted to know, could there be a way to change the Torah? The answer, number one, is for a temporary injunction. Now, is there a way to ever make a permanent change to the Torah? That is also possible, not as a command to violate the Torah, but as a restraining order from the Torah. And that is, we find with regards to these three mitzvahs. What are these three mitzvahs? The mitzvah of shofar, the mitzvah of lulav, and the mitzvah of Megillah. Text number 12. According to biblical law, it is permissible and obligatory to sound the shofar on Rosh Hashanah when it falls on Shabbos. However, the sages decreed that we should not do so as stated by Rabbah. For Rabbah stated, everyone is obligated to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but not everyone knows how to sound the shofar. Sages made their enactment not to sound the shofar when the Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, lest someone take the shofar by hand and go to a knowledgeable person to learn, and thereby carry 4 cubits in a public domain. The same applies to taking the lulav when Sukkot falls on Shabbat, and reading the Megillah on Purim when it falls on Shabbat. So, what we see over here is that sometimes you could change a certain law if it is, as you see, the sages can tell us to be passive and not to do a mitzvah act, lest it lead to an unintended active transgression. So being that he was afraid that people are going to transgress the laws of Shabbos, therefore, it was enacted that you should not do it on Shabbos. By the way, this coming year, if I'm not mistaken, Rosh Hashanah is on Shabbos. Let me see, pretty sure. Rosh Hashanah is on September 19th, which is a Shabbos. First day of Rosh Hashanah is Shabbos, as is the first day of Sukkot. So we will be following this injunction this year, unless Mashiach comes, which hopefully Mashiach will come and tell us to do differently. Additionally, the mitzvah of Megillah, the Purim that we have in the diaspora could never fall on Shabbos the way the calendar is set up now. But what we know as Shushan Purim, which is the Purim in Jerusalem, that could fall on Shabbos. Anyway, let's continue on. You know, they say the rabbi was on his way to shul, and he looks through a window. There's 3 members playing poker on Shabbos. He storms in the house and says, "What's going on? I said you can't play poker. Don't you know you can't play poker?" So one of them says, "Rabbi, I'm so sorry. I forgot it was Shabbos today." The rabbi said, "Okay, please always make sure to keep your calendar and know when it's Shabbos." Second one says, "Rabbi, I forgot that poker was forbidden on Shabbos." And so the rabbi says, "Okay, now you know for the future, poker is forbidden on Shabbos." The third one says, "Rabbi, I forgot to pull down the blinds." Anyway, so for hundreds of years, Jews have not heard the shofar or taken the lulav when Rosh Hashanah and Sukkot fall on Shabbos. And now you have this rabbinical enactment, which is a fence around the Torah, saying that as a protective measure to guard against sin, we could be passive and not do a mitzvah. So again, they're not changing the Torah per se. They're saying, we agree there's a mitzvah of shofar. We agree you should be doing it on Shabbos. There's a mitzvah of lulav. We agree there's a mitzvah of lulav. We agree there's a mitzvah of Megillah. However, in order to protect from not violating a more grave commandment, we're telling you that in this circumstance, don't do something that you otherwise would do, and that would be a way to protect yourself. Now, this is with regards to laws that are passed down that we talked in the beginning, that could this be affected by received law? So the answer is, with regards to received law, You could never change the law, but sometimes you could be passive and not do something. Now, when it comes to derived and legislated laws, so then it's a little bit different. And yes, it sometimes could be changed in a different way. For example, if the sages offer two divergent derivations, and it was before the Sanhedrin took up the issue, each person would follow his or her or local besdin to follow that way. So this divergence would cease and everyone would have to follow the Sanhedrin. However, another Sanhedrin could revoke or amend the derived law. Text number 13. If the Sanhedrin used one of the hermeneutic rules as per their perception to derive a law and rule accordingly, and another court arose afterwards whose reasoning dictated to revoke the previous ruling, they may revoke it and rule according to their perception, as it says, you shall go to the judge who will be in those days, meaning your days. This indicates that people are obligated to follow the court of their own generation. So, returning to the case that we discussed in lesson 4, we talked about two people lost in the desert. Remember that? Two people lost in the desert and the bottle of water. So, if one would rule like Rabbi Akiva and then a later Sanhedrin would change and rule like Ben Betura, in theory, they could go back and change it. If you have a Sanhedrin, and this rule applies only to the Sanhedrin and not to an individual sage, and the same, the Talmud has the same status as Sanhedrin, meaning that the Talmud, once this says something in the Talmud, and the Talmud makes it clear that this is the law, you can't, because what happened was once the Sanhedrin ceased to exist, so who has the final ruling? So the final ruling is found in the Talmud. You see that when Ben Gurion became the prime minister of Israel, he wanted to set up the Sanhedrin, but many rabbis told him that it would be impossible. So he says, why not? So they said, one of the conditions to be a judge for the Sanhedrin is that one has to be someone that hates money, son of Betzah, he has to hate money. And where are you going to find such Jews who despise money? So he said, don't worry, for money I can find anything. It still didn't happen, okay. Anyway, historically, even great sages of the Jewish people have not ruled differently than the Talmud, and so the Talmud was considered the final ruling. Now, of course, questions can come up afterwards, but they cannot change a ruling within the Talmud, and everything has to be within line of that. So the Talmud would be as if the Sanhedrin today, the final sage, so to speak, of who you can go to. Now, there is a certain court that comes along and says something different than a previous court, then they can change it. Text number 14, if the Sanhedrin issued a decree, instituted an edict, or established a custom, and this practice spread throughout the Jewish people, but a later court arose and sought to nullify the original order and eliminate the original edict, decree, or custom, the latter court does not have the authority unless it surpasses the original court in wisdom and in number. If it surpasses the original court in wisdom but not in number, or in number but not in wisdom, it cannot nullify its rulings. Even if the rationale for which the original court instituted the decree or the edict is nullified, a later court does not have the authority to negate their rulings unless they are greater. How is it possible that the later court could surpass the original court in number, considering that every Sanhedrin consists of 71 judges? This refers to the number of sages in the generation who endorsed the Sanhedrin's ruling. So you have to have at least more number and wisdom who endorsed that Sanhedrin's ruling to be able to change it. And we're soon going to see of how something was not being able to change even though something did change, nevertheless, there's another aspect that was not changed because of this. But I'm first going to show you a short video to illustrate the background of this. So let me pull it up here. One second. Where am I? Share my screen. Okay, let me play this video for you to give a little bit of background.
Have you ever wondered how the Jewish calendar works and how it came about? The Jewish month begins with a thin crescent. The moon grows until it is full, wanes until it cannot be seen, and eventually reappears. This cycle takes approximately 29.5 days. Since a month needs to consist of complete days, a month in the Jewish calendar is sometimes 29 days, and sometimes 30 days. The solar orbit consists of 365.25 days. The difference between 12 lunar months and the solar year is almost 11 days. The Torah, however, states that Passover must be in springtime. If no adjustment were made 11 days earlier each year, eventually drifting into winter, then fall, summer, and spring again. The Jewish calendar thus presents two challenges. Who determines whether a month is 29 or 30 days? How can the lunar and solar cycles be coordinated and balanced? In biblical and Mishnaic times, the Sanhedrin was responsible for determining the months and years. On the 30th day of every month, they would cross-examine witnesses who claimed to have seen the new moon. If the witnesses' accounts were corroborated, that day would be declared the first of the month. The previous month was now retroactively determined to have had only 29 days. If no testimony were accepted, the Sanhedrin would declare the following day the first of the new month. In order to balance the solar and lunar cycles, the Sanhedrin periodically inserted an extra month into a year, creating a Shana Mu'uberet, or pregnant year, more commonly known as a leap year. This was the situation until the middle of the 4th century, at which time the Romans forcibly disbanded the Sanhedrin. Hillel II, the last leader of the Sanhedrin and a descendant of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, anticipated this. Therefore, before it was disbanded, they established a fixed calendar for posterity. The Sanhedrin declared and established all future new months and leap years, granting the fixed calendar the same validity as the original system. To this day, Jews throughout the world use this sophisticated structure created by Rabbi Hillel. Throughout the centuries, the calendar has been one of the backbones of Jewish unity, as it has ensured that Jews the world over celebrate Jewish holidays on the very same day.
So, all right, let's go back. I'm just, I'm sharing the video in the chat. So if anybody wants to watch this YouTube later, you can watch it later. So there's a link to it in the chat. Okay. So based on everything that we said, so we now know how the, whoa, 1 second. So we now know how the lunar month happens, and we now know what takes place. With all that introduction, okay, now we're back on. So the later court can only make a change when it is greater in number and in wisdom. So this brings about an interesting idea. So we just had a holiday called Shavuos, right? We just ended that holiday yesterday. This would be a very simple question. why do we have 2 days of Yantif, whereas in Israel, they have 1 day of Yantif? So the reason is because when they were deciding the new month according to witnesses, so it could come a time that, let's say in Jerusalem, the witnesses will come and decide that yesterday was the new month. And then by the time the message gets out to wherever, to the Jews living in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia or wherever there's Jews living, or even in far parts of Israel to Tzfat, it may already be a day or two later. So now they're not sure when they established the first day of Rosh Chodesh. Is it 29 or 30 days? And it could be by the time they get the message, it may already have been a day later than when it was actually established. So therefore, our sages said that you should keep 2 days of Yantif, being that you're not sure. And so therefore, in the diaspora outside of Israel, you always keep 2 days of Yantif. And in Jerusalem, you keep 1. But you can ask a very simple question. If we follow the Jewish calendar today, we know now very clearly when the Jewish holiday is, because we all follow the same calendar. So why do we have to have a separate Yantif? And the answer, the simple answer is, as we said before, because once there's an established ruling by one court, another court cannot go and change that, even if it makes more sense for the time being. Even if it seems like it's a thing that would make most sense to remove it. Especially for the holiday of Shavuos, because the holiday of Shavuos is always going to be 50 days after Pesach, so it really doesn't matter. It's always going to be the same. So why do you need 2 days for Shavuos at all? So text number 15, all laws legislated by the sages have many esoteric rationales they did not reveal in addition to the revealed rationales. And this is one of the important ideas to understand. There's always a deeper esoteric reason why that thing is, why our sages came up with the law. In other words, it's not only about the law itself, but there's always a deeper esoteric reason. For example, we talked earlier about not blowing the shofar on Shabbos. There's also a deeper esoteric reason, which is taught in the Hasidic teachings of why we don't blow the shofar. Because Shabbos itself is able to accomplish what the shofar is able to accomplish on Rosh Hashanah. Shabbos itself is able to reach that point. And our sages brought it about in a more simple, pragmatic way. The same is true with the story of the second day of Yantif. There is a deeper esoteric reason, a Hasidic reason, if you will, of why we're able to keep 2 days of Yantif even today. And that is what we read in text number 16, from Rabbi Nachman Lubavitch, the third Chabad Rebbe. With regard to the second day of festivals, that in Israel they celebrate 1 day, whereas in the diaspora they celebrate 2 days, we shall understand this based on the writings of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero in his work. Or Ne'arav. He writes that the world at large, because of its coarse nature, cannot assimilate the light and energy of the festival in 1 day in the way that the land of Israel can. Meaning every festival consists of revelation of supernal sanctity that transcends time. This is the reason for the festival. The land of Israel, a land that God seeks, a land close to godliness, a land of lofty and pure nature, can process this illumination in the 1 day. In diaspora, however, 1 day is not sufficient to receive this illumination because the diaspora's connection to God is more distant. Diaspora requires 2 days to process what Israel could process in only 1 day. So this is a deeper meaning. It's not only about the fact that we just can't change the law the way it was, but the esoteric meaning is saying because the diaspora needs 2 days. So this is a practical reason only the Greater Sanhedrin can change whether there's a. But the problem is that the Greater Sanhedrin doesn't know what's the real deeper rationale behind it. It's not only a pragmatic decision. It's also a deeper decision that the other Sanhedrin may not know the reason for that. And finally, when Mashiach comes, the written and received Torah will remain the same. As expression of the divine will, they cannot be altered. So what's going to happen when Mashiach comes? when Mashiach comes, we'll finally be able to perform so many mitzvahs that we couldn't perform for hundreds of years. And because it didn't have the temple or other reasons. And according to the Rambam, the halachic definition of Mashiach is a person who will restore the ability to perform all the mitzvahs. And that's what the Talmud tells us, that all the mitzvahs are going to be abolished when Mashiach comes. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that we're not going to fulfill the mitzvahs anymore. But it means that it's going to be so simple. It's going to be something that's just so easily acceptable for us, that because we'll be in complete harmony with God's will and his understanding. And so everything that happens will happen automatically. So it'll be like nothing for us. And so when Mashiach comes, the Sanhedrin is going to derive laws differently. The schools of Shammai and Hillel, like we talked earlier, they debate only derivations. But when Mashiach comes, halacha will be in accordance with Beis Shammai, because we know that the Sanhedrin at that time is not going to change their minds, but it's going to be in a way that in that era we're able to connect to the more, should I say, just the more difficult view of Beis Shammai, the one that's a more judgmental view of Beis Shammai. And so we'll be willing and eager to step up to more advanced challenges. And in this climate, the sages of the Sanhedrin prefer the derivations of Shammai over Hillel. So this is what it means that when we talk about the times of Mashiach, it's not that anything's going to change when he comes, but that we're just going to see everything in a different way. We're going to see it in a different light. We're going to see it for what its true meaning and definition really reflects. As we said earlier, the words of Hillel and Shammai are both true, but at different times we're able to appreciate them in different ways. And this is essentially what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. When Mashiach comes, we're going to see it in a different light than we were able to see it then. So this concludes today's lesson. By the way, you can go to torahcafe.com/go/JD5, as in Judaism Decoded 5. I'm going to show quickly the summary, the video summary. One second. Just got to do a screen share.
Lesson 5. 1. Just as God transcends creation, so does his wisdom and will. The idea, then, that mitzvot were responses to archaic circumstances is untenable. 2. God does not change, and therefore his wisdom and will, the written Torah and the received oral Torah, are not subject to modification. 3. Modifying the Torah would obstruct the channels through which we experience a relationship with God. 4. We do not heed the directives of a prophet if they contravene the Torah, even if the prophet produces miracles. 5. The Talmudic sages refused to heed a heavenly voice that contravened a Torah law, sending a clear message that nothing can change a Torah law. 6. A prophet, or bid din, can issue a temporary injunction to suspend a mitzvah, but this has rarely occurred. 7. A Sanhedrin can overturn a law derived by an earlier Sanhedrin. 8. To overturn a legislated law, the later Sanhedrin must be greater than the one that issued the legislation. Next week, is there a rational basis to accept that some 3,300 years ago, God revealed himself to our ancestors at Sinai? Why was Maimonides, a rationalist par excellence, so convinced of the historicity of this event? And in what way is the Jewish claim of divine revelation any different from the many thousands of claims made by various other religious groups? Join us next week for the final lesson of Judaism Decoded.
All right, that will conclude today's